It's the summer of 1941 in Quincy, Florida, the seat of Gadsden County. Tobacco fields stretch out in slow green rows, and the heat hangs so heavy it feels like a physical burden. Overseas, war clouds are gathering. The United States is inching closer to open conflict in Europe and the Pacific. Across the country, black newspapers are calling for a double V campaign: victory against fascism abroad and victory against Jim Crow at home. African Americans are enlisting, drilling at bases, and preparing to wear the uniform of a country that still denies them basic rights.
So you have black soldiers getting ready to fight for democracy overseas, while back in places like Gadsden County, democracy doesn't even protect their lives at home.
Exactly. Historian Tameka Hobbs argues that Florida, often imagined as less southern than Georgia or Mississippi, actually had one of the highest rates of racial violence when measured against its black population. In the early 1940s, as the nation talked about freedom and human rights, Florida remained a deadly place for anyone who stepped outside the boundaries of white supremacy. It's in this world that a man named Arthur C. Williams crossed a deadly line. His story is one of survival, then betrayal, and finally a community bound by a code of silence.
You mentioned a specific term earlier, lynched twice. What does that actually mean in Arthur's case?
In 1941, Arthur C. Williams became the target of white vigilante violence. The first attempt on his life followed a familiar script. Allegations were made, a mob formed, and a group of white men decided that the courts were too slow to satisfy their sense of racial order.
Wait, so there was a first attempt? He actually survived the initial attack?
Yes, this is what makes his case so haunting. In the initial attack, he was seized and brutalized, but he did not die. Whether through chance, resistance, or pure will, he survived what was meant to be his end. That survival mattered. For a brief moment, the normal pattern of lynching, the accusation, the murder, and the silence, was interrupted. Arthur's battered body became living evidence. He was a witness to the violence inflicted on him.
And you would think that surviving would trigger some kind of protection. If he's a witness, he needs a guard, right?
You would hope so, but in the Jim Crow South, often survival deepened the danger. Arthur sought medical help. He was placed in an ambulance, headed for a hospital bed, the kind of care anyone should expect. Instead, the act of seeking treatment became the stage for a second, more calculated assault. Arthur was taken again, this time not from a dark roadside, but from the custody of those charged with preserving life. He was removed from that ambulance while injured and vulnerable, stripped of the only institutional protection he had left.
So he survives a lynching, reaches the point of medical help, and then is seized again and killed?
That is the horror at the heart of this. It shows how fragile black life was in 1940s Florida. Even a hospital, even an ambulance could be penetrated by white supremacist violence if the local power structure allowed it.
After he was killed the second time, what happened to the men who did it? Was there any outrage?
What followed was a chilling, organized quiet. No one was held accountable. No mob was prosecuted. No system was put on trial.
Was that silence just out of fear, or was it more organized than that?
Dr. Hobbs describes it as an infrastructure of silence, a code that covered entire communities. White residents refused to identify the attackers, local law enforcement failed to recall details, and black residents, understandably terrified, knew that speaking out could make them the next target. By the 1940s, the spectacle lynchings of the early 1900s, the ones with crowds and postcards, were giving way to these more private, secretive murders. They happened in the shadows, on rural roads, or, as in Arthur's case, through the manipulation of the very institutions meant to protect the public.
So when the historians say he was lynched twice, they aren't just talking about the two physical attacks.
Exactly. He was lynched physically, and then he was lynched again through the refusal to name his killers, the refusal to mourn him publicly, and the refusal to demand justice. the silence was the second murder. It signaled to every Black resident in Gadsden County that their lives could be taken without consequence.
Today, we remember 1941 for Pearl Harbor and the start of the Greatest Generation, but Arthur's story feels like it belongs to a different version of that history.
It's a reminder that for Black Americans, the war for freedom had two fronts, one overseas and one at home. If Arthur's name isn't widely known today, that is by design. The goal of the Code of Silence was to strip away his place in the record.
So by telling this story now, we're essentially breaking that code.
That's why the work of historians like Tameka Bradley Hobbs is so vital. By naming Arthur C. Williams and by reconstructing his case from fragments of archives and oral histories, we challenge the silence. Remembering Arthur is an act of resistance. It refuses the idea that his life was expendable. It insists that the WWII campaign, victory abroad and victory at home, cannot be understood without reckoning with the people who never saw the war's end because of terror in their own backyards.
It makes you wonder how many other names are still hidden in that silence.
Many, but we start by saying his, Arthur C. Williams. We study his case, we tell his story in our communities, and we acknowledge that the fight for justice didn't end in 1945. His memory still calls us to account today.